I'll be responsible for hosting today's session. We'll take Q&A questions after the presentation, so feel free to submit those in the Q&A tab, which is also next to the chat. So I wanted to give a warm welcome to Dawn Wages, who will present the ethical stack Wagtail and Gatsby. Dawn is a former project manager turned JavaScript and Python consultant, WagtailCMS core team member, conference speaker, active volunteer for the international Django community, and participant in the ethical source movement. Welcome to the stage, Dawn Wages.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm welcome. Hi, all that are watching, and hello to all that will be watching in the future. Hello, future people. Thank you so much for joining my talk. We will be talking about ethical and accessible stacks, specifically my flavor that I've picked as a consultant for my small and medium projects is Wagtail Gatsby, and then we'll also touch on some ethical source licenses. Don't worry if any of these words are foreign to you. This is an introductory talk. And other versions, I showed some code. I walked through how to actually get this project set up. Here, that's reduced down to one slide. It is a jam-packed slide. We are in an accessibility conference, so I understand if there may be too many words on that page. It is for reference. And I am available after this talk on Slack. And my next slide, I'll also give you some ways that you can reach out to me and see my face again. I will be taking questions, as Stephen mentioned, and this is best understood if you have a little bit of background in web development, but it's not necessary. This is served as a primer and to try to kind of get you into what's possible. All right, so my name is Dawn Wages. I am a Django engineer and Wagtail core team member. I like to work with small and medium businesses, NGOs, specifically Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer enterprise. And we'll talk about it again, but you'll hear the word ethical source organizer. That is what I do. I'm very proud of that and really excited about the movement we have coming, and hoping that by the end of this presentation, you'd like to join this movement as well. You can find me on Twitter. I used to tweet too much, and now I tweet almost too much. I am also an organizer for various Django cons. You may have seen me organize DjangoCon 2019 in Europe, DjangoCon Europe in 2019, and also see me at various DjangoCon US's. I spoke for DjangoCon Australia last year, and I'll be an organizer for 2021 for DjangoCon US. I blog. I've just started blogging at glittertech.dev and my personal website, dawnwages.info. So as I mentioned, I'm a JavaScript and Python consultant, and I use this stack that we're discussing coming up to host a project near and dear to my heart at the root. It is an anti-racist ethical source license. And so in this talk, I dive into a little bit of code, a lot of cool features. Some important ways that open source engineers can contribute to accessibility and accountability of their communities. Other versions of this talk I mentioned got a little bit deeper in, but we can do all of these really cool things and care what our stack does in our community without sacrificing cool tech. So some Bing words to keep top of mind. So we're learning about static site generators, progressive web apps, Python for the web, React, content management systems. I'll describe a little bit more about what they are and what they do. Ethical licenses for open code. GraphQL is a big Bing word. It's big in the industry now. And this stack does include GraphQL and headless backends. All right, so Gatsby is a React-based open source progressive web app generator. Wagtail is built on Python. It is essentially Django with more. It is all Python. It is a content management system. That is the body of the headless approach. That is the back end. And Gatsby serves as the head to the headless approach of headless web CMS. We also use, we'll be talking about Gitpod, which is how I will equip you to be able to spin up an instance of Wagtail and Gatsby quickly. And I'll talk a little bit more about what Gitpod does. And then GraphQL is a query language that aggregates, or it brings in all of your data stores depending on how you use it, into one single data layer. It is a graph API, and it will allow you to query by nodes and relationships of your nodes, rather than the strictest of definitions in the REST API, which is more traditional approach for API building. In this stack, we have both REST API and a Graph API, and I'll talk more about how it does feel like sometimes there are two engines in a car, but I can talk about how they work together as well. And we have visual representations for both. So this served as kind of a case study for me. I work with small and medium businesses, and I wanted to be able to figure out what is the best product that I can hand off to my end clients without sacrificing speed, without sacrificing performance, but also kind of get it shipped and out the door quickly. So these are two powerful frameworks with really great communities. Similarly, with Django, you come for the community and you stay for the code. So Wagtail is a content management system. What that does, it provides a web app that your end user, that you can hand off to your end client, would be able to log in to an admin and then update content themselves. Specifically with Wagtail, it comes feature rich with a lot of really cool things like moderation, similar to what your end user may be more comfortable with maybe like a WordPress or any social apps that they've used, where they get a WYSIWYG editor, a what you see is what you get editor. And so then we also have Gatsby on top of that. Gatsby takes over the rendering of the information and the front end of it. And it is a React-based option. It's built all in JavaScript. Again, it is feature-rich, and it is a progressive web app generator. Most people may be familiar with what a static site generator is, and it is of the same flavor, but what Gatsby lauds to do, and it's the only progressive web app generator I know of to this point. But you write it in React. It distills down into the what you've built for your application, and then it will rehydrate into an application with all of the sleekness and functionality that you built in a progressive web app, but highly performant. It does serve very small files, and that helps with your hosting costs and the performance for the end user. So let's talk a little bit more about headless. I did describe it before, but the answer is flexibility, right? So you see the purple layer on top, that is your front end. You have Gatsby there, but you could also replace that with a Vue or a React or an Angular. We have backends similar to what Wagtail would be. You can have Rails or Django or any type of node application. And then you have different data stores. I don't talk about data storage at all in this talk at all, but that would hook up to things like Postgres or Mongo or Firebase or things like that. So when you abstract all of your decisions in these particular frameworks, they are a way to the top level of your application. You do have a single point of decision, but then you also have a single point of failure. That's kind of a common thing when you are using highly opinionated databases, or frameworks. that are highly abstracted. It's all a trade-off on whether or not this is going to be the right path for you. I love to jump in and try shiny new things. So this was really an exciting challenge for me to see if I could get my usual consulting clients with some really cool progressive web apps. So when you're separating your front end and your back end, you're able to put data into one big bucket. In order for that to be flexible, you can render in many different ways for your application. So if I did want to switch out the Gatsby with Vue or just regular React, I would be able to do so. This also gives you a stateful application. And so when I say stateful, that is when elements on your components on your web app will have, we could say beginning, middle, and end, beginning, middle, middle, end. It would be a login, for example, or I am in the middle of a chat feature and this modal is open and this modal is closed, this modal is to the left, to the right. That is when it has multiple states. And so we not only need to track the state of the user, which normal web applications can do with databases and relational databases and things like that. But we also need to track just the state of the component as it moves around the screen or things like that. So that gives you a little bit more of a lay flavor of what a stateful application and why somebody would want to use a progressive web app. And you can definitely fake it. And there's no difference between faking it, I guess, but it is all many times it is all just JavaScript, but it is about giving that user experience that is more flow-like and more modern. You can also bring in other services from the headless infrastructure. For example, when you want to bypass what you're doing on your web app, your front end web app, but you want to use the back end that does more heavy lifting for like things like SMS messages or emails, or like a rules engine is one that I have with a client. You can definitely do that. And so it makes it more than just a website. It is a web app, right? And so then I have the diagram to the left to kind of give a more of a visualization on what that means. Okay, so here's the diagram again, and then we go more into detail on how the progressive web app or a static site generator or a progressive web app generator works. So during build time, you have your content. You start at the top left. You have your content that you're building your files. That is where I'm building all of my code in this scenario. It is in React. When you do your build time, it will distill down, and that is the static site generator that I'm mentioning. It does a little bit of magic, and that's why you see, excuse me, magic wand over there in the top left. It distills down, and then it will rehydrate into that more simplistic website, right, over in the build time type right. So from website, it will go down to that web hosting, and it hosts in a more performant manner. And then it goes back and forth between the end users when they are searching that content. And so that's that setup. Wagtail uses the model view controller paradigm. And so when we are handing off and adding the front end on top of Django or Wagtail, it takes away, or it stops. We are no longer using Django for the view and the controller. The front end will now do that. And so, but you're still getting a lot of value from keeping Wagtail and Django in there. It has a lot of model and data management tools that are that a lot of node applications still wrestle with anytime they're starting a new big project like this. And so in the back end, I do have those two little icons, logos for GraphQL and Django REST Framework. What comes out of the box with Wagtail is Django REST Framework. And when I mentioned REST API, with REST, you have a standard design for web APIs that is more classic. It stands for representational state transfer. So it has a standard definition of protocols. It's safe and it requires client-server communication. No information is stored between requests. But it's really different than the way Graph APIs work. Graph instead uses nodes and edges. And it took me a long time to recognize that this equates to just objects and relationships, the nodes being the objects and the edges being the relationships. So the graph attempts to address sometimes the issues that REST has with overfetching data and information. For example, if I wanted to pull all of the comments of all of the authors who had commented on a particular post, I would be pulling the posts, the authors, and all of the comments, or all those particular comments. And so those are 3 calls potentially. But what you do when you are specifying a call with GraphQL is you are being able to build into that relationship, and it is more performant to be able to do that one call. When done right, you can do one call. So the graph call client can formulate this call by pulling ones and identifying the relationship of each, and it organizes based off of that request. So Wagtail uses REST, GraphQL is, and then Gatsby uses GraphQL, and it does, as I mentioned, it does feel like sometimes there are 2 engines in a car, but underneath you can see to the right, you have more data stores that you would hypothetically be able to put into a more complicated application, and it does allow for a lot of flexibility to have GraphQL in there as well. And they are connected. There are more and more ways. And this is really the hairy part about putting these 2 together. And as I mentioned, they're both newer frameworks in the industry that a lot of people are adopting on. So there are more ways that people have been connecting them. The way that I'll be showing you is with Wagtail Grapple. Is a package that you're able to pip install into your project. But there are other ways. I just saw an npm package that you can use to, I think, maybe do some of the same things. So as this grows, please watch out. I mean, I'll continue to, and I'll put it on the screen, update my blog. Wagtail has also done a case study on Gatsby and Wagtail together. And there's more and more resources just coming out daily, really. Just, every time I look, I see more. So what sets Gatsby apart in particular, I have seen them. I think they're also a part of the conference. Deku is a leader in accessibility, web accessibility, and they follow and participate in WCAG standards. They're very passionate about making sites that work for everyone. And you definitely see that reflected in even the way the developer experience. They have a linter that is a plugin where they even prevent you from being able to commit code that violates some of the more egregious web wonky web things that people do that are not accessible. There's also themes and starters. So one of the things that was really important about this case study was being able to get up fast, get something up fast and quick for my clients, but still very good. And so there's starters that are pre-configured sites, but there are also themes that take configurations and you can add them in as they are as a site package. And so there is a particular file, and you can find some more of this information in my other blog posts. that you would be able to update what package it is and install those. And that is where in that one file you'd be able to have it that information abstracted to use that theme. And it really cuts a lot of the work out because someone else has already done that work for you. Similar to Wagtail, which I'll get into, there's a huge plugin library. I mean, the users of this framework has to be incredibly large, and it goes from all the way from analytics and e-commerce to, as we mentioned, accessibility and CSS and UI features. And the community is really fun. If you tell Gatsby that you're doing things for the community, they're like send you really cool swag and stuff. And they're very active, lots of resources. And there's always people who will be friendly and answer questions. And I like to consider myself one of those people and a resource. So should you see this talk and you have more questions on getting started specifically with Wagtail and Gatsby, or with Gatsby or Wagtail more generally, feel free to hit me up. I'm always love to meet new people in the community. And now with Wagtail, very similar points, and one of the reasons why I paired them together, and you could clearly see my checklist on finding new stacks. One of the things being on the core team is we are very, very proud of our tight release cycle. We try to stick to every 3 months we have a new release, and we definitely have a feature-packed new release that came out only a few days ago, just a little bit over a week ago, 2.13. We also have showcases of sites that people have done with Wagtail, and ways to get in contact with them and potentially open code that have authored it. A similarly robust plugin library, obviously focused on more of the back-end things, but definitely because you can do Wagtail full stack and you can use Wagtail templating, there are also front-end plugins with that, but it's very feature-rich. You can do calendars, authentication, localization, things like that. And we have an excellent community. I mean, an extension of the Django community, incredibly friendly people, just lovely to be around. And I try to be one of them. So how fast is it to spin up a new site? It's pretty fast. I mean, both individually, you can do it in a day, in just a few hours of tooling. And then when you're connecting them together, it is a little bit new. It's a little hairy. One of the larger learning curves is when you are for me particularly, and what I've heard in the community, is getting over that GraphQL hump. But if you have a proficiency in GraphQL already, that is something that'll expedite some of that tooling. So what I have on the screen is a short link to what will always be my latest Wagtail and Gatsby tutorial. Right now, it is one that is referenced from PyCon Australia. I gave in September of 2020. But there is going to be a new tutorial coming soon that will update with Python 3.9, Wagtail 2.13, and Django 3.2. So this is the hairy slide. Don't get overwhelmed. I wanted to make it pretty, but also really functional. This is for reference, but I've distilled down into about 13 steps of getting started. We can start with step 1, where you are opening Gitpod. And so what Gitpod does is you can use almost the URL from almost any of the major hosting or like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. There may be another one. You could type that link in, and what it will do is it will spin up a Docker instance and create an environment for you. You can also specify your Docker instance if you have specific requirements. But it has a lot in the standard Docker instance that they spin up. And then it will start your project, and you will have a config file, a YAML file that will go through the process of opening, that you could specify. Go through the process of opening a new project. And I have a link. Wagtail has gone through the process, core team has gone through the process of creating that YAML file. So when you do open that link from the tutorial, it will spin up a new Wagtail project for you and automatically create the folder structure. From there, you're starting your app, and this is an example of a blog app that I go through with you. You're installing step 3. You're installing with pip. 4, you're configuring a few things, adding circle around and referencing to your install apps in step 5. You're going to migrate your database to match all of the models that you've created in step 6, and you're going to run your server, and that's going to have it run in the Git pod instance at port 8080. And then the next step would be going through and adding some of that demo data, example blog post, example index page, things like that. And you can also test your endpoints. And step 8. 9, we're installing Gatsby. This is what from 1 through 8, all of that is handling all of the Django. From 9 on, we're doing the Gatsby. Installing Gatsby globally. In 10, we are using what I referenced before was a Gatsby starter. And so this is going to have similar like a blog theme. And you're using, using the Gatsby CLI and say Gatsby new site. And then you specify the starter link and it will spin that, it will create that for you. We add some things to the environment file, the .env file, to know where to point. We CD into site, and then you do Gatsby develop. And so there are many Gatsby commands that I could go more into detail with. But Gatsby develop will spin up a developing instance and will do the build for you locally. And then you'll have your app running at port 8000 on your Git pod instance. And this is all within your web browser. This is a VS Code like IDE for you and for your development experience. We ran through that very quickly. So, but hopefully what I was attempting to convey is how easy, but how quick and how straightforward that it can be. And we're working to make it more straightforward every day. You know, there's more of us out there. So I used this approach in the stack to build a project that's really near and dear to my heart. I've been participating in June 2020 was a really, really tough time for me, as it was for a lot of people around the world, as we were all reeling from the George Floyd murder, and thousands of people protested in the streets. I really wanted to figure out what my personal impact to the movement could be. And as a software engineer, there's so many different ways that people can do things. I was previously inspired by an ethical license created in 2018 called the Hippocratic License. It was created in the wake of GitHub having a relationship with ICE detention center. And there were a lot of people who participated in some of that open code that was serving the ICE detention center that did not intend for any of their intellectual property to be used in that fashion. Regardless of the particular movement, I think all engineers who do feel like they want to participate in the open source community should be empowered to know that their code is going to be used in a way that builds a world that they want to live in, and that is accepting to them as well. So, for example, I build a small little calculator, an algo, or something, and I want to keep it open, and I have a standard license that does not have an ethical license on it. Someone could use my code that has no that is, you know, hypothetically neutral and apolitical for whatever means that they want. I'm inspired by Angela Davis, and so the naming of At the Root comes from her quote, radical simply means grasping things at the root. I also like the double entendre that licenses are at the root of your project folder. So I'll talk a little bit more about At the Root. You can find At the Root at www.attheroot.dev. You can also find us on Twitter at sign ATTHEROOT. So we are coming up with 3 different products at the moment. And this is truly similarly to the ethical source movement, which I'll also speak on. We are at the beginning of a movement. At the core of it, we start with the license, and there are many others. There's probably, I know about a dozen ethical licenses at that point that have sprung up since 2018 in the Hippocratic license. Some are for the environment, some are for pay discrepancies and working standards, and it is an international movement. At the Root is in an attempt to be an international movement as well for an anti-racist ethical source license. We start with the license itself, and we are currently in the drafting phases of that. Then we continue with the anti-racist checklist. So no, you cannot checklist empathy. But what you can do is have a checklist for best practices for your application on how to be actively anti-racist. And it takes action to be actively anti-racist. For example, for social apps, if there is not, one of the recommendations is to always have a block feature. At its core, it does not denote race in that recommendation, but to be able to protect its users of an interaction social app, a block feature is commonly recognized and protects people from racial attacks, for example. And we get more into detail as we grow as a movement and get more subject matter experts. We hope to have a long list, and we can have it as long as we can, to give more detail on ways that your application, whether it's from biometric data, collecting biometric data, or global positioning, or whether or not to collect certain types of data, whether it is important to collect the racial data in one fashion or another. And then lastly, a third product or a third part of the movement is to have a review board. When you are in a movement to speak for a group and advocate on behalf of a group, it is important to prioritize the most marginalized of people. And because of that, it is my personal opinion in the way that we're structuring this movement that we have people to be held accountable, to be public facing, and to be voted in to their positions. And so it can be more representative of a group of people. And so we are in the process of doing all of these things. If you are interested in any of these things, please feel free to email us at contact@@theroot.dev. So this is all stemming from the ethical source license. So what is an ethical source license exactly? It's as I mentioned before, it's any license that explicitly restricts the use of open code on the basis of a particular ethical ideal. All right, we're back on the page that I accidentally skipped forward to. So this is a little more about the ethical source movement itself. It started in 2018, as I mentioned. For me, the linchpin is really empowering open source engineers to be confident that their intellectual property is going to be building products and is going to go to use in products that create a world that they want to live in. We're building a movement. Tech is not neutral, nor is it apolitical, however much we want it to be. That simple algo that I put in my example, with the intent of being nothing but a a cool piece of code could be used in all sorts of ways. And by adding an ethical source license at its root, I would be able to have accountability, or make sure that there is accountability that something that I created is not going to go go anywhere and do harm. And as I mentioned, we're building a movement. If you want to learn more and find more resources on ethical source licenses, please visit Ethical Source. And there are more reading materials to go on, and we are open and interested in having a discussion on what this means for open source at large. We are also partnering with the Corporate Accountability Lab, and we have attorneys that will be helping us craft licenses and continue to work on our behalf to strengthen this movement. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. I really appreciate it. As you can see, I'm really passionate about all the things that I discussed before. I like to go deep into the code, but it's also about what the code's impact is. And you can reach me at dawn@glittertech.dev. And again, I'm on Twitter, Dawn Wages Says, and you can find me on my website as well.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. Thank you for this amazing presentation. It looks like Craig had listed a few questions. So
okay.
Now, Tom will take a little bit of time to answer some of the questions that were submitted during the presentation. So let's go with the first one and just go from the first one down, Don.
Okay.
Craig had asked, how does the ethical license specify its terms? Is there a single shared phrasing, or is it a framework for developers to build their own license based on their values?
So there are about like a dozen licenses that exist. Each are different. Some specify that it is started at the core, was maybe started from the MIT license. That's what At the Root is starting from, and then building off of. Currently, At the Root is building and is currently writing it, but there is no standard framework. They can all end up in different ways and have different varying degrees of enforceability expected to be in there. But with council, with versioning, with several iterations, we're hoping to have something that is substantial and enforceable. That's the goal.
Craig has a few more questions, actually. So he says, I love the ethical license idea. Are you aware of any frameworks that have adopted the ethical license?
There are a few. They have not been litigated anywhere in the world yet, or enforced anywhere in the world yet. But there are a few that have, and I think they would be the Hippocratic license, but there are a few.
His next question is for Gatsby. How often does its CMS backend offer enough flexibility to create everything you need? And when it doesn't, how easy is it to write your own custom Django code to extend behavior?
So Gatsby really serving as the React substitute of the front end. So it really, if I wanted to build more on what Gatsby can offer me, I would do that one of two ways. I would either write more JavaScript, or I would add in plugins. And their plugin library is large, and has a large breadth of things that it can cover. As for the way that the CMS, it interacts with the CMS, there are some limitations. So my first deploy with Gatsby had Netlify CMS, and Netlify has a lot of great features. Its CMS is a very easy one to get up quickly, but you're definitely making some trade-offs with that. So I was able to easily switch out from Netlify to another backend CMS, Wagtail, because it's a little newer. It was not the easiest. I had to do some GraphQL learnings, but it was not terribly difficult to do so. And all of the work that I would want to improve my CMS experience is going to be writing more Python, and the same that I would do with any Wagtail site, regardless of what the front would be in.
Craig's final question. He said, you had mentioned co-locating REST and GraphQL. Can Gatsby respond to either, or is there a translation layer to turn one type of request into another?
Yes. So Gatsby specifically only responds to GraphQL. It would be a GraphQL to the, it's Django REST framework to Gatsby, GraphQL to Gatsby. And it is the only way that it translates there. The Django REST framework can go off and do its own things elsewhere and still exist. And then one of the cool things about GraphQL is it can accept data from other sources outside of the Django REST framework.
Any additional questions? I know there was another. Those are great questions, Craig. Thanks.
Thanks for the great questions.
Yeah. There was something in chat. Craig had said a few seconds ago, thanks, Dawn. I misphrased 2 questions and you still answered them.
Cool.
There you go. Well, if there's no other questions, okay. Doesn't look like it. I wanted to thank Dawn again for this amazing presentation and for answering these questions, and for the great, it was great to have you, Craig, and I know there was another, the person just left. We had another person as well. But it was great to have you. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, Craig, if you had any additional questions for Dawn, we had created a separate Slack channel, and could be found at the very top of chat if you wanted to go there and keep the conversation going.
Cool.
So thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks,
Great
Dawn.
moderator.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.